Hello, this is your host Dan Zapasky for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. My special guest today is Moira Martingale. She has written a book called Cannibal Killers. These are no ordinary killers. They are monsters who murder, mutilate, and carry out the most gruesome, unimaginable act of all, eating the flesh of their victims. Cannibal Killers includes the world's most evil psychopaths, Jeffrey Dahmer, Ed Gein, and Andrei Chikatilo, with 8 pages of harrowing photographs. Moira Martingale. I'm not sure if we have a connection with Moira Martingale as of yet. I think we may have a problem, but let's see if we have Moira Martingale. Hello, Moira? Anyway, we may have a problem, miscommunication. Moira is in Great Britain, and I've changed the time of my program from 8 p.m. in the evening to 9 a.m. to accommodate this interview, but there may have been some miscommunication exactly who she was supposed to call at that time. So until she does get my email and the number, I will go through her book for her until we get her on the line. Anyway, the book is called Cannibal Killers, and Moira Martingale is the author, and this book came out in 1993, first in Great Britain, and then I was going to ask her the question about the further publishing, but the copy I have is St. Martin's Press, so that's its distributor in America anyway. This book has been a bestseller for years. I've seen it on the shelves for many years. I wouldn't say I saw it in the 90s, but I've seen it for many years. And it's an incredible book. The publisher is trying to get people interested in the book by discussing the world's most evil psychopaths, Jeffrey Dahmer, Ed Gein, and Andrei Chikatilo. But she also discusses other cases, and with her background in clinical psychology, let me actually get her background for you here. She is particularly interested in abnormal and clinical psychology, and when she did her psychology, when she actually did her psychology degree, she also had an interest in Gothic literature and did a fair amount of research, and an interest in evolutionary psychology and anthropology, and all of these things came together to be able to have her assemble this incredible book called Cannibal Killers. Let's see if we have her on the air right now. Hello, Moira.
Hi there.
How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for agreeing to our interview today. What I did in the interim while we got you connected was to have me introduce the book a little bit. So I will thank you very much for agreeing to this interview, and welcome to the program. And we're going to be talking about Cannibal Killers, your incredible book. Now, what I was just going through just a little bit for our audience was your background that enabled you to be able to write this incredible book. The perspective that you chose was quite different from many, well, almost all of the true crime books that I have read of that genre. Let me ask you, what is your educational background that enabled you to write this book, and why were you interested in writing this book? What issues did you want to explore?
Well, educational background, I did a degree in psychology, degree in psychology and English, actually, my first degree, and I did an awful lot in the psychology part with abnormal and clinical psychology. Then I went on to do a master's degree in English, and I did an awful lot on Gothic literature, Dracula, and 19th century Gothic literature, and then I went on to do a PhD in Gothic literature. So I suppose the literature aspect, which also overlaps on evolutionary psychology and anthropological interests, I suppose I would call it, because I wouldn't say I'm an expert in anthropology, but I suppose it was all those things that came together, because the literary parts of writing about Dracula and various other vampire novels, you have an awful lot of the bloodlust aspects, the sexual aspects of books like Dracula, and if anyone's ever read any Anne Rice, those sort of, the sexuality that's attached to blood drinking, which has its roots in lots of other things like religion and so on, and our own primitive past. So I suppose all those are the things that drove me, and I suppose the first question is that when the issue of Jeffrey Dahmer and Andrei Chikatilo in Russia, they were all out. This all happened about the same time as Silence of the Lambs came out.
Right.
And because I'd done a lot of research, and because Silence of the Lambs seemed to be creating such a lot of shock, what people were saying is, what on earth possesses anyone to do something like this, to cannibalise somebody else's body? And I suppose I set out to answer that question in more of a research way than just writing a sort of verbal literary version of a slasher movie. I didn't really want it just to be like that. I wanted it to actually have some sensible research behind it. So that's what I tried to do. Whether it was successful or not is debatable, of course.
Right. Now, for the specific research done for the book, how long did it take? And maybe you can tell our audience, through your research, you found out some of the history of cannibalism. Can you give us a little bit of that?
Well, the problem is that when you talk about cannibalism, you have different aspects of it. You have the aspect of people who used to, if we look at our ancestors, the cannibalism was very much embedded in our own history, and you do get instances like the Sawney Bean case in Scotland back in now, when was it, 15th century?
Right.
And he and his whole family lived out in a cave, and apparently just ate people. They captured people who were on the road and ate them. I don't think there was any sexual aspect to that at that time. I think it was purely expedience, if you like, because they were hungry, and that sounds awful to say, they were hungry, but that was what they did. They didn't do it. The whole family didn't eat other people for the sort of reasons why we're seeing our sadistic killers these days doing it. They were just predators, and they just regarded any prey, whether they had 4 legs or 2, as being fair game, and they killed, I think it was something like 40, 50 people that they actually consumed. And I think there's also cases like the instances in the Andes where people's plane crashed, and that was in the 1970s, I think, and they had nothing else to eat, and they turned to cannibalism to stay alive. And I mean, I think we see this sort of great fear, the terrible fear that everybody has deep in their psyches of being eaten. You see that in films like The Road and books like The Road, should I say, which I don't know whether any of your listeners have seen. But life breaks down, society breaks down, and there are then crowds of cannibals that have to be avoided, and it's the full horror of that. So there's that aspect of cannibalism mixed in with all the mythical, tribal belief systems which are generally tethered to religion and religious directives, either imagined, well, they're all imagined, I suppose. If you take religion as meaning anything from tribal belief systems to modern religions which have lasted for centuries, you have a lot of blood beliefs attached to all those as well.
Yes,
I answered your question or not?
Yes, you've covered quite a bit of it. I was surprised, though, to read, like you do make the point there that regardless of whether it's a primitive a primitive society, we'll say, or whether it's a modern society that has a developed religion, there still has been these aspects of bloodletting and cannibalism and some of these things that are all intertwined, as you say. But I was surprised to read about ancient China's history regarding cannibalism. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that. I thought that was very surprising and fascinating.
That is really quite shocking, isn't it?
Yes.
I opened the book with that. But actually, it wasn't that many centuries ago. But yes, they used to use slave girls. I suppose it was basically cannibalism and all these other sadistic murders. It's basically using people as objects, and it's the people who have power use the people who are powerless. And with slavery and our whole history, in that particular case, they would fetch in slave girls who were very beautiful, and they would bring them in, and people who were there at the banquets, the wealthy people who were the king's guests, would sort of see these beautiful young girls, and their mouths would water at the thought that they were going to be eating them soon, because then they would take the girls away and they would kill them and eat them, just like you'd go into a restaurant and see a salmon in a tank and say, well, actually, I'd like to have that one, or a lobster or a crab. It was the same principle at work. It's just like a sort of incredible demonstration of power. That slaves were just objects belonging to powerful families.
And this carried on for about 300 years, according to your book.
Yes, it did. I'm trying to think of the most recent date when it was actually still in force. I think it was probably about the 1600s, 1700s, when this was still going on in certain places in the world. Maybe not necessarily ancient China, but there was still. Actually, I don't think it might have been. It was still in ancient China when it was going on. I'm sorry, I haven't got dates in my mind.
Right.
But I know it was comparatively recently, quite shockingly recently, really, if we look back at our history. We're not just talking Neanderthal here. No,
it's interesting and incredible. Now, we need to, before we go into an exploration of some of these worst evil psychopaths, as your book purports to have included in the book, we need to discuss just a few things. Well, I think we need to discuss why this seemingly alien behavior, this deranged act of eating another human, is not classified as insanity. And maybe maybe we can just start with that. We will talk about the psychopathology, about the psychopathic killer as well, just to prepare people so that we have a basis to understand what we're talking about here.
Right. Well, the argument about sanity is very interesting, because, of course, we would say somebody who does something like this is utterly insane, that no sane human could do the sort of things that we witness these people doing.
Right.
But I suppose in a legal sense, what they're looking for is people who actually are able to plan. They say there's sort of two sorts of killers. There's a sort of organised and sort of non-social killer. They plan. They behave in a normal way. They plan the crimes in a very detailed way. They don't actually kill anybody when they think they might get caught. So they go equipped, and they make detailed plans, such as, for instance, Jeffrey Dahmer, when he was going out to gay clubs to try and pick up young men to bring home who he wanted to drug and kill and eat and have sex with. He would prepare his room in advance. So he'd move all the furniture so there was plenty of room. And he would set the video so that he had a film to show them while he gave them a drink with drugs in. So it was all extremely organised. Quite often these sort of criminals might even, when they've killed somebody, take the body away and hide it, or they might even put it somewhere later on so that someone will be found, someone will find it, and then they'll follow the case with great excitement, because they get off on the fact that the police don't know who it is and that they do. And then you have the disorganised, asocial killer, who they are more to be seen as sort of friendless outsider characters who are loners. Most of them, a lot of people are loners who are still organised. So it doesn't exactly fall into completely black and white camps here, but they murder in a more uncontrolled way. They don't have the same method. They don't take as much care. They usually get found more quickly because they aren't as careful. They're more likely to kill somebody and then abandon the body and just escape because they haven't actually thought it through. So they are considered to be disorganised, asocial. Now, I guess that those sort of killers who do act in a frenzy without preparation are considered, an insanity verdict is more likely to be considered for them, perhaps, than the organised killer, because what they're looking at is legally they're looking at is the crime, whether the person was out of his mind when he committed the crime, not really what they did afterwards with the body, but basically whether they were insane and in the grip of some sort of crazed, disorganised urge when they did it. And most of the killers that we've looked at, as I looked at in the book, were not. They were very methodical, but that's why they managed to escape for so long. I suppose the least methodical of all of them was Richard Chase from Sacramento, who he was known as the vampire killer. He bought a gun and he practiced, and very rarely do sadistic killers use guns, but he wanted blood, and he did not take the sort of care, I suppose, that some of the others. It makes it sound, when I'm saying taking care, it makes it sound like a positive attribute. Obviously it's not. But he did act in a more crazed way. But the sanity argument does go back to history, where that is essentially it. Did they know what they were doing? Did they know the difference between right and wrong when they actually committed the crime? Right.
Now, you were talking about Jeffrey Dahmer, and he's a great case, and that's why you likely included it in your book, because there is quite a bit to discuss and quite a bit to see with his particular case. Now, Jeffrey Dahmer is fairly well known, and I remember seeing the movie Silence of the Lambs and finding it incredible, and then a few months later in Milwaukee, Jeffrey Dahmer, a real-life cannibal killer, was arrested, and his crimes were, obviously, people know, more horrifying than any fictional book or movie could ever be. Now, there seems to be a fair amount of psychiatric study of Dahmer, having the cooperation from his family, and even Dahmer himself helped authorities collect valuable information about him, especially in regards to his upbringing and its effect on him, and his eventual progression to serial killer later.
Yes.
And he was, when we talked about organized and disorganized, they do classify him as being mixed. And at trial, there really was an issue of whether he was an insane, or at least insane at some point. Can you talk a little bit about Dahmer and what you found interesting about some of the study that was done after the fact, given that Dahmer was willing to talk and not attribute some of his behavior? Well, maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
I think you're going to have to explain that further.
Well, the thing is,
his behavior?
The thing is with Jeffrey Dahmer that his father was interviewed and Jeffrey Dahmer was interviewed, and Dahmer was very adamant to say that, and there was evidence as well, that there was not much of the typical attribution, in terms of his background, in terms of his eventual progression to serial killer. He wouldn't fit a profile.
Right. Yeah, because of course, the usual thing is to look at the background of these sadistic killers, and you can usually find a very troubled childhood and difficulties with parental arguments, rows, violence, neglect, and there wasn't really any of that really with Dahmer. He had a very happy childhood, really, in terms of what his family offered. The family were not a neglectful family or violent. And he, when they were searching for possible reasons as to why he turned out as he had, the sort of reasons they found were terribly feeble ones, like, oh, well, he was very jealous when his younger brother was born when he was 6. Which,
right,
of course, that happens all over the place, and they don't all turn into killers. He was doing things like finding roadkill victims, animals on the road, and cutting them up when he was a very small boy. And he was admitting to being sexually stimulated when they were cutting up animals in biology, which again is so extreme that nobody would really think that they could identify with that. And one of the other psychological requirements, I suppose, that people would find to say this will deflect someone from their possible path of murder, is that not necessarily a close maternal relationship, but a relationship with somebody, the person who makes a difference, who can actually save them, if you like, by having a close relationship. Well, I think Jeffrey Dahmer was pretty well adored by his grandmother, and his parents were not bad parents, and his brother, of course, was fine. But so there were no real reasons that you could actually put your finger on, other than something in the genetic makeup somewhere, that some wires that have got crossed somewhere in this child, because there were so many possible thoughts. Someone said it was because he was gay. So not someone said. One of the psychological reports is he was gay, but he really hated his own homosexuality, and so therefore he would project that onto his victims, and that's why he did this. But I mean that also wasn't really a case for cannibalism. That might have been a reason why he hated this himself, wanted to kill other gay people. But then you say full stop. Really, the rest of it, trying to drill holes in their heads and turn them into zombies, removing the flesh and saving the skeletons and hanging the skeletons in the shower to take photographs of them, and keeping heads in fridges and performing sex acts on them. I mean, this was also at the absolute far reaches of extreme behaviour that nothing could be an explanation. There don't seem to be any real explanations as to why he became like he was that you could find in other murderers that I looked at least.
What is surprising when you first read about the motivation for some of these serial killers and some of the outrageous acts that they do, the obvious overkill, the mutilation, posing of victims, all sorts of characteristics and signature of some of these serial killers. Did you find in your research that the actual added horror of cannibalism as a feature of some of these serial killers, was that also involved with the sex act as well? Was it sexual to these people?
Yes, it's the ultimate act of power, isn't it? The absorption of that person and complete destruction of that person and wanting to make them part of themselves and be powerful. The sadistic stabbing and mutilation and so on, there isn't necessarily a sex act as we would interpret a sex act attached to that. I'm probably repeating things that you already know here, but the actual frenzy of stabbing and mutilating is the sexual gratification, and a killer may have an orgasm doing that without actually having what we would consider to be normal sex. So if you're looking at this sort of behaviour, biting and the biting act, which of course is very much tied up with sexuality in our primitive backgrounds and in the psychological literature to do with vampires and vampiristic behaviour, which you often find in psychotic, sadistic or mental patients, you would find that quite commonly. I think it's all just tied up together. So yes, it would be sexual is the answer.
Right.
Sorry, I rambled on a bit there, didn't I?
No, you didn't. Not at all. It's now we've talked about Jeffrey Dahmer, and you have included we're going to talk about some of the main people that you have featured in your book, and you can tell us why that you felt it necessary to include them and what you learned from their particular cases when you drew it back to giving you any insight. Obviously, some of these killers, Ed Gein is one of the killers we're going to be talking about, and Edmund Kemper, they couldn't be coming from completely different backgrounds more so. So maybe we could start off with Ed Gein and briefly tell us who Ed Gein is, what he was accused of. I think some people do know him, but a lot of people don't know that he engaged in cannibalism. They know him from other reports that they have, some information that they've gathered. Tell us about Ed Gein. Well,
he is probably most famous because he was the inspiration for several films like Psycho and in Silence of the Lambs. I think the character of Buffalo Bill was based on Ed Gein.
Right.
Because what he ultimately did, he started off as a necrophiliac and would go to graves and get dead bodies to do what he wanted to do, but ultimately ended up in killing women to do it. He lived out in the wilds in Plainfield, Wisconsin, with his mother, who was a very dominating woman, and his brother. And his brother and his mother both died, and he was left there on his own, a very lonely, strange weird-looking little man with pale, icy eyes, and but he was very keen on hunting. But he had this drive that he ultimately ended up sort of digging up bodies from graves, and then he would take their skins and their genitals, and he would fashion them into suits to wear, and he would dress as a woman, and he would hang the bodies up and as if they were deer, and dismember them, and he would use the skin to make chairs and footstools, and also a suit of clothes for himself. So the theory was, one of the theories was that he was so totally dominated by his mother that he felt he was like her when he dressed like that, because I mean, in normal transvestitism, I actually use the word normal on that, people would do it and not really, they do it because they like to look like a woman and they want to be taken for a woman, but he of course did all this in secrecy because he used parts of bodies. So there are, you can't actually say, oh, he was a transvestite, he just wanted to be a woman. There was obviously the greater sickness there.
Right.
And he was caught when it was a day out, when everybody went out hunting in the town, and he went to the local village store and he just killed the woman who was there, who was a middle-aged woman, and took her back home and did all the things that he did to all his victims, and cannibalized them. Yes, they found parts of the flesh in the house. He'd dissect the bodies and he'd eat the hearts. He'd keep the heads and the sex organs, but he would also eat the flesh and the liver and hearts, and then he'd make decorations for his body, for his house, from all the other body parts. Apparently, he made a belt out of skin and cut off nipples and used the bones to make a table. And so yes, he did. He's what non-psychologists would call a total nutter. I mean, it's too extreme to even imagine, but you can see why somebody like Norman Bates in Psycho was based on Gein, with the obsession with the mother. I don't know whether there was any suggestion, but I keep calling him Gein and you call him Jean. I'm sorry, I looked at it as a German name, and I thought you'd pronounced it Gein, but yeah, I don't think there was any evidence that he felt he was being given messages by his mother to do this.
Right.
But that obviously was what Hitchcock took when he made the film of Psycho, that Norman Bates was being directed by his mother and controlled by his mother.
Now we have just a couple more cases briefly to talk about, and then we want to talk about, one of the most bizarre cases is obviously this Issei Sagawa from Japan.
Sagawa.
Okay, Issei Sagawa. Okay, got it. Thank you. But let's talk about just briefly this, and this is one of the most horrible cases, is this Andrei Chikatilo. Just briefly tell us about.
Right.
I didn't know about this killer at all, and what's interesting is that it's just a few months after the world hears about Jeffrey Dahmer and his Chamber of Horrors, another even more, if there can be someone that ups the level of evil, it's this guy. So please tell us a little bit about this guy.
Yes, well, he's Russia's worst serial killer, and he's right up there in the whole world. With I think he claimed to have killed about 60 people, but actually was only charged with 53 murders. He was born in a period in Russian history when there was great poverty and famine, and he told a story. He claimed that he was driven to this, or that he became like this, because when he was a child, his mother had told him that he'd had an older brother who had one day gone walking in the forest and had vanished because he'd been taken away and he'd been eaten, like in a fairy story. So it's like all parents tell their children, don't go off with strange men because these terrible things could happen, and they tell them stories of Hansel and Gretel. But in Chikatilo's case, he claimed that this is the thing that actually started him off because he couldn't stop thinking about his little brother who was taken away and eaten. There's no evidence, I don't think, that this story did actually happen. It's just that Chikatilo claimed that's what he'd been told, and I suppose you could think the mother might tell some story about what could happen to little boys who go off in the forest. But he was obviously a disturbed child. He was a very sort of tall and gamely sort of boy, and he had a problem with bedwetting to quite an old age, and of course he was ridiculed at school because of this. He grew up, was intelligent. He was an intelligent person. He went to do a degree and became an English teacher. And he got married, and his wife found that he was a very doting husband, except they did have a lot of sexual problems because he was impotent. He had a problem with impotence, which he'd always had through his teenage years, which again helped to make him feel like an outsider. But to all intents and purposes, his marriage with the 2 children was happy. But he then, at one point, he started abducting children, and he abducted a little girl, and in a frenzy he killed her and with a knife and ripped her apart and enjoyed the blood and ate and drank, and discovered that this was the thing that made him sexually satisfied. Because he hadn't been sexually satisfied in any other area. So having found that, he then went on to kill more and more people at a greater and greater level, commit more and more atrocities on their bodies when he killed them. He wasn't really particularly fussed whether they were male, female, adults. I suppose the only people he avoided were adult males because I suppose they would be able to fight back more readily.
Right.
But he just escalated his desires because of course, all these fantasies that these sort of men have. The reality is never as good as the fantasy, so they have to keep upping and upping the extremes they go to in order to try and achieve the same level of satisfaction, which is why the crimes of one person get more and more brutal and sadistic, because they find it's not enough to do what they did the last time, so they have to make it more extreme. And so he committed all these crimes over a long period, and the police were totally useless because they were confused for a start because the victims were dissimilar. And normally, if you were looking for a serial killer, they would normally kill within their own sexual preference.
Right.
And as with Jeffrey Dahmer, he was gay, he killed other gay men. In fact, with Jeffrey Dahmer, if I can just divert for a moment, I think there were another 5 murders while he was in Germany, while he was there in the army, that were sadistic and mutilating murders that they thought they might have actually been attributable to him. But the fact that there were women amongst this, they actually dismissed that and said, well, no, because he didn't actually kill them. People tend to kill within their own sexual area of preference. Chikatilo didn't do that. He sort of killed everybody. It's like pansexual, and he was sexually stimulated by it all. He was known as a railway killer because he used to ride the railway trains and select victims, and he was an extremely personable and agreeable and talkative chap. He would go and chat to a woman. Quite often they would be drifters or prostitutes, homeless people, but he would go and chat to them, and he'd talk to them about the weather and about, whether they'd collected any mushrooms in the forest, and people liked him, and he would convince them to go with him, and then he would just sort of leap on them and tear them apart. But the police, eventually, they actually arrested various people for the crimes, and but they refused to let the press know. They refused to publicise this, which would have been their best weapon, really. So even though in this place called Rostov, they'd got sort of, at the time, about 30 people who died, that they had no idea, and were no nearer to catching the person who'd done it. They didn't want to release it to the press because, I suppose, partly the Russian fear of secret, fear of things not being secret, and also the fear of causing panic.
Right.
So nobody really knew that this was happening, and then eventually they did actually. And then they did apprehend him at one point, and they got a victim, and they got a semen sample from the victim, but they got Chikatilo and they did a blood test on him, and the blood type and semen type were different, so they didn't pursue that anymore because it was assumed at that time in the 1980s that they were always the same, but it was completely, there wasn't any possibility that people could have different blood and semen types, so they let him free.
Wow.
And it was only later that they actually discovered this can happen, and Chikatilo himself believed that made him unique and different and very special, the fact that his blood and semen type didn't match. Shall I carry on, or were you going to ask me a question?
No, sorry. The Chikatilo, though, one of the features, you were talking about some of the serial killer profile features, and one of those is many of these serial killers contact authorities or the media, or when they are finally caught, they relish the idea of giving all the details of their murders. What was it about Chikatilo that was unusual compared to some of these other people? He was particularly hated. You would be if it was 53
murders. You mean
murders.
About the trial?
Yes.
Do you mean when he was actually caught and tried? Well, when he was caught, he denied it at first. He denied anything at first. And they, but then the psychologist who was talking to him convinced him that only somebody who was totally insane could have done the sort of crimes that he was accused of, and so sort of dangled the possibility that he might actually not be executed, but might be put in a psychiatric hospital. At which point, Chikatilo admitted everything. He admitted to the murders that the police had got details of and evidence of, and gave them, facts that nobody else could know. He then admitted to another 20 murders, and then took the police to places where bodies were buried. And then when he was in court, he then decided to pretend to be insane. So he started behaving like a complete madman, rattling the bars, because he was put in a cage, not so much to protect him and protect everybody else, but protect him from the crowd, because the scenes at the court were just full of victims' relatives who were screaming for his blood and demanding that he should be given to them. And so he would take his trousers off and display himself to everybody. He would say that he had breasts and he was going to give milk to people, that it had been a setup, that it had been a communist plot, and he just played mad, because I think he realised at that point that he might not actually escape being executed after all. And you do get, but of course when he went back to his cell, he was perfectly normal and fine. They had to protect him in prison, by the way, because a relative of one of the victims was a warden at the prison, so he had to be under special protection there as well, because people were so anxious to kill him.
Is he still alive today?
No, he was executed in 1994.
1994.
But the sort of things he said, when he admitted it, he then started claiming that he was a special person, that he was special. On this blood and semen thing, he claimed he was special. He claimed that the people he was killing, that he was doing a public service, because they were just ruthless elements, he called them, drifters, who he was cleaning up the streets, which actually, coincidentally, is what a British killer, the Yorkshire Ripper, claimed when he, in the 1970s, that would be, late 70s, when he was killing women in Leeds, Yorkshire, and they were all prostitutes. And so he was saying that he'd been told to do this by God, to clean up the streets. Well, Chikatilo said the same sort of thing, really. But he was... the thing that's so amazing about Chikatilo is that his wife, actually this is very similar to the Yorkshire Ripper case as well, his wife was amazed because she thought that he couldn't even kill one person, never mind 50-odd, because he was such a kind and caring, loving husband and father. And that's even more concerning, that these people can lead a normal life, and then it is very much a Jekyll and Hyde situation, isn't it? As if they have got something inside them that's just released, and they turn into a monster.
Well, to explain that, certainly that's what we talk about antisocial behavior, which was formerly referred to as psychopathic behavior, or the psychopathic killer. And when people say, well, they're not insane, well, then there has to be some categorization, and I think antisocial behavior sounds a little nicer or a little more normal than...
Well, actually, they stopped calling people psychopaths, didn't they? They started calling them sociopaths, as if that sort of makes it better. I don't know whether it was a...
well, it sounds more harmless.
I suppose what it is that originally people would be declared psychopathic, and it would be usually people who'd committed crimes. But I think what's been discovered in the last 20 or 30 years or so is that we could all appear on a psychopathic scale. If you imagine a continuum, then you could put all of us on there somewhere, being psychopathic to some degree or another, or sociopathic to some degree or another. And not all people who are psychopaths or sociopaths are killers. They just, and a lot of people who are psychopaths or sociopaths are very, very successful at what they do and are in big business. And the sort of qualities that a psychopath would have, they would be extremely charming, very, very glib. People like them. They're totally ruthless, and they regard everybody else as being there to serve their own purpose because they're so wholly egocentric. There's no sense of guilt or shame or no conscience. So those sort of skills, particularly if they're able to charm people and people like them, are very useful in business. And so you don't necessarily have to kill people to do this. And presumably the aspect of desiring to slaughter is in conjunction with being a psychopath rather than just being a psychopath on its own. So you have another element working there, but I think probably psychopathy is very much at the heart of all the killers that we're talking about, because one couldn't do these sort of things without feeling guilt or remorse.
The only thing is...
yes? Sorry.
What I thought, though, was that, and, you know, I understand exactly what you're saying, and I've read all the stuff from Robert Hare and the Checkley psychopath checklist. The thing is, though, is that shouldn't there be some distinction between a psychopathic killer and a psychopath? Otherwise, some of the characteristics of the psychopath are more inclusive. A lot of people are self-centered. A lot of people exhibit no conscience, if you're asking me if they exhibit no conscience, but obviously they justify it. There's a lot of business practices that could be termed psychopathic. So shouldn't there be a real distinction, and not such a nice and fuzzy word like sociopath, to distinguish these people?
Well, I suppose that's what I meant about the continuum. I have a 17-year-old son, and I think 17-year-olds probably all fairly psychopathic in that he's totally egocentric.
Sure.
And
narcissistic.
Big time there. Yes, that's right. And but however, he doesn't kill animals or anything like that.
No.
But I think it's a phase that boys of that age go through, where everybody's really there to serve their needs. So yes, that's true. What you're saying is quite true, and I think they have actually identified areas of the brain now where they can judge people to have these strong psychopathic elements with the what's it called when they do that imaging, where they can actually show various areas in the brain that they can say this person's to a greater degree psychopathic. But yeah, I suppose what I'm trying to say is that if you have somebody who is psychopathic but has no other sexual drive to torture or kill or even dominate another person sexually, well, that's another element that has to be added into it. I don't think you can just say, oh well, that's because he did this because he's a psychopath. I think you could say, well, he is a psychopath, but that's not the reason he did it, because there are also psychopaths who don't do that.
I see.
Sorry, am I making myself unclear? I'm really just sort of saying what I believe.
Right, certainly.
But I'm sure there will be far more qualified psychiatrists out there who would be able to correct me in areas where I'm not correct. But I think psychopathy is, I think you would have to be. It's rather like the studies of sadistic killers who are in prison. You can say that of all the sadistic killers who are in prison, there's a figure like 60% of them have been abused in childhood. So therefore, but that actually means that another 40% of them haven't.
That's right.
So you can't, there are all these correlations that you can make, but they're not necessarily causes, because you can find substantial exceptions. And in a way, that's rather like, yes, all these killers will be psychopaths, undoubtedly, but that doesn't mean that everyone who's a psychopath is going to be a killer.
Yes, let's. We don't have that much time, so let's. I want to include this in because this is one of the most fascinating portions of your book, and a story that I had never heard of at all before, anywhere. So, in the book, you discuss a case that is truly the most bizarre for the reaction of the country in which this cannibal killer lived and killed. You state that the Japanese, more than most nationalities, have always shown an appetite for the bizarre, especially if there's a macabre element of suffering or pain to spice up the entertainment value. And you also say that Yukio Mishima, a homosexual sadist who was stimulated by the sight of blood, became the most successful Japanese writer of all time, and what he wrote about Japanese society seemingly embraced and also greatly influenced a Japanese man, which is featured in your book, named, again, you can correct me on the pronunciation, Isia Segawa.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't swear to it. I've always put it Isia Segawa.
Okay, there we go. We got that.
Right?
That's probably right.
I'll understand you.
Okay, now what did he write about, and how did it influence Segawa, and what did Segawa go on to do?
Well, I can't really tell you all that Mishima wrote about, but he was quite a famous Japanese writer, and he did write. I think he was very interested in the whole Harry Carey aspect of Japanese literature. There's a lot of, I don't know, I was going to say violence, that's perhaps unfair, but I don't know whether you get some of the Japanese programs in America, which I've mentioned, I think, in my book. There was a series, now I can't even remember what it was called now, where people would, a bit like the I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here that we have in England now, where people go to the jungle and are made to eat horrid things like, like cockroaches. Yes. It was very much a game show where people would go and be humiliated and have to do things that were really painful and terrible, and everybody in Japan thought these were wonderful. And there were quite a lot of serious. I think there's I don't know, I don't want to say about the whole Japanese people, but I think the reaction to Segawa's murder and the way that TV and media had reacted to it, I think there's a sort of, I don't know, flattening maybe of response to these things, and maybe it is because of the Japanese traditions of nobility and bravery that were attached to oh gosh, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the word, but the swordsman, the swordsman, the film of the same name with Tom Cruise in it. Samurai, thank you, sorry.
Yes, Samurai, sorry.
Samurai, and all the traditions that are associated. And right. Mishima was, he killed himself by ripping open his own stomach, and he's fantasized about that and written about it in his literature. But I haven't read any of his literature, I have to say. I just know that because I read it myself. So whether that was an influence on Segawa, I don't know. But Segawa was obviously a strange little individual.
Now what he did was accepted. Why I mentioned the poet, because it seems odd that you do talk about the Japanese being this nationality unlike others that has this penchant for the bizarre. Now, the thing is that this poet is a celebrated poet, despite the nature of his poetry and the subject matter, and then this Sagawa becomes, despite his crime of murder and cannibalism, becomes also. There was also an aspect of his father being rich, and you say that's part of the outrage of this as well, that he had preferential treatment. But still, bottom line, the society accepted him and his murder and cannibalism, and elevated it to a point that he was entitled to do this because he was an artist, and he was entitled to this special experience.
It was an artistic act, yes. Yes, he had shown, he was a very small man, he had shown an inclination to attacking. He had a thing about large Western women, and he had done an attack made an attack on a woman when he was younger, in his 20s, and she'd fought him off. But he'd been prosecuted, and his father had arranged to have him sent to Paris to try and get him out of this phase. And when he was in Paris, he met a Dutch woman who was also studying at the university. He was a very clever man, and he befriended her, and then he proposed that he should sleep with her one night when she came round to his house, and she said no, and so he killed her. He shot her in the head, and then dismembered her and kept parts of her body. But it was all, he was apprehended very quickly because he had no way of disposing of her body, and so he cut it up and tried to dump it put it in a suitcase and tried to dump it in the Bois de Boulogne in the lake, but he was seen, so he ran away, and he was caught very, very quickly. But what happened was that he was actually declared to be insane, and he was sent to a psychiatric hospital in Paris. But his father intervened, and his father was a very powerful businessman, and he intervened and arranged to have him transferred to a psychiatric hospital in Tokyo, near Tokyo. And so he was transferred, and he was only in there a few months before they, again, I suppose with the father's intervention, he was released from there. So I think he was only actually incarcerated for 2 years after this horrific, horrendous murder.
Right.
So yes, and then when he was set free, he then became, during the time in hospital, he wrote about his experience, and this went back to Japan, and people started declaring that he was a very rare artist, that he was a celebrity. And once he came out, he went on television, and he was presented as being somebody extremely unusual who'd done something astonishing. He'd acted on his artistic impulses because he said he wanted to absorb this woman, and it was the purest form of love, and that he would, even though he now says he's cured and he's not a cannibal anymore, he still says that he would still like to actually eat somebody else who agreed to it, or be eaten himself by some beautiful Western woman. And the thing that's so disturbing is that we look at this with growing horror and with our mouths dropping open in amazement. And yet, of course, only a couple of years ago in Germany, we had the case of the German chap who wanted to cannibalize somebody and advertise on the internet.
Right.
Do you remember that case?
Yes, and he found someone, and they mutually agreed.
That's right. He ate his body, and they agreed to be killed. He even wrote a piece of paper absolving him from any guilt. And so you do think, well, the internet has obviously opened new doors to people of the most extreme depravity, and it gave a problem to Germany to try this guy. He was called I don't know how it's pronounced, Maiwes, Armin Maiwes, and they didn't really understand, because could he be charged with murder when actually the person had agreed to be murdered?
Right, that was his defense. Yeah.
Yes, it was an extraordinary case. And so when Ishikawa says, might have a dream to be eaten myself, you think, well, actually, presumably, there are some people who do, because this is the case. But yes, it's extraordinary, because he's still a celebrity, is Sagawa. He writes about it. He even did an eating out column for a magazine once, a gourmet page. in a magazine. And
oh yes, that
he
was
not.
Barbecue recipes, unbelievable.
That's right, barbecue recipes. It's just, I just find it so macabre that this would happen.
Yeah, it's amazing.
But I suppose also, the other thing is that I also find it very concerning that the advent of the internet has meant that the sort of people who would once have felt themselves to be outsiders and they would nurse their interests guiltily to themselves, they now find out there are lots of other people like that out there, and in a way that makes them feel it's normal. That's my biggest concern about the internet.
Well, the thing is, too, before the advent of the internet and the popularity of the internet, there was serial killers that met up with other serial killers of the same mindset and then united forces. So I hate to see the new development give it another 20 years. But we only have a few minutes left, Moira, and I would like to talk about a completely opposite thing, a completely different subject that you've been involved with for quite a while. You can tell us a little bit more about this French party house experience. Sounds very interesting.
Oh, French house party, yes.
And
yes,
you also,
company, yes.
and also your company has been the services that you provide have been included in the top 100 vacations to enrich your life. And so, tell us a little bit about French House Party, please.
Oh, right, thank you. Yes, the 100 Best Worldwide Vacations to Enrich Your Life were in by Pam Grout. It's a book that's connected with National Geographic. Yes, we do short break holidays in a house, beautiful house in France that's got 8 bedrooms and swimming pool and tennis court. We do all-inclusive holidays. We do creative writing. We have Dean Friedman coming to do a songwriting seminar for us in the summer.
Right.
And we do books and art and digital movie making, and we've also launched our Gastro Academy this year for various options for food and wine with some top chefs from the area who run very top restaurants in Carcassonne. It's near Carcassonne in the south of France. So it's yes, it's rather different. It's a lot lighter than what we've been talking about.
Certainly. Now, this book, Cannibal Killers, came out in '93. Was I correct with that?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, '93.
First edition.
First printing. Okay.
It has been published in lots of different countries, including Japan, I might add. And I think it's in its fourth edition in America. We've just a new version been published in England in paperback with my original publishers, and then I think it's readily available in the States. It's continued successfully.
Yes,
and I have also been told that it does appear on a lot of criminology degree lists. So I suppose that's quite a dubious honour.
Yes, well, it's definitely would be used as a resource, because I know that it's written from a perspective that you don't see, and it's laid out very, very carefully, yet very, very entertaining. It's a compelling book. Now, for those that are interested in your French house party experience, maybe you can give us the website for your company?
Oh, thank you, yes. It would be www.frenchhouseparty.co.uk.
Sounds great.
So French House Party, the way it's written, would mean it's got 2 H's right in the middle. You should come out.
Yeah, it sounds good. Oh, it sounds great. I get away from all this. I've been involved in some stuff myself in the last little while, and you need something
I believe so.
You need something as a break, definitely, from that. I want to thank you. I want to thank you very much, Moira, for a very, very entertaining and informative program. For our audience, you've been listening to Moira Martingale. Her book is called Cannibal Killers. It's an incredible book. You can find it everywhere, St. Martin's Press. I want to thank you, Moira, and have yourself a very good evening. And thank you very much once again.
Thank you for inviting me. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. You've been listening to a program, True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Good day. She also had an interest in Gothic literature and did a fair amount of research, and an interest in evolutionary psychology and anthropology. And all of these things came together to be able to have her assemble this incredible book called Cannibal Killers. Let's see if we have her on the air right now. Hello, Moira.
Hi there.
How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for agreeing to our interview today. What I did in the interim while we got you connected was to have me introduce the book a little bit. So I will thank you very much for agreeing to this interview, and welcome to the program. And we're going to be talking about Cannibal Killers, your incredible book. Now, what I was just going through just a little bit for our audience was your background that enabled you to be able to write this incredible book. The perspective that you chose was quite different from many, well, almost all of the true crime books that I have read of that genre. Let me ask you, what is your educational background that enabled you to write this book, and why were you interested in writing this book? What issues did you want to explore?
Well, educational background, I did a degree in psychology, a degree in psychology and English, actually, my first degree, and I did an awful lot in the psychology part.
Her book for her until we get her on the line. Anyway, the book is called Cannibal Killers, and Moira Martingale is the author, and this book came out in 1993, first in Great Britain, and then I was going to ask her the question about the further publishing, but the copy I have is St. Martin's Press, so that's its distributor in America anyway. And this book has been a bestseller for years. I've seen it on the shelves for many years. I wouldn't say I saw it in the 90s, but I've seen it for many years. And it's an incredible book. The publisher is trying to get people interested in the book by discussing the world's most evil psychopaths, Jeffrey Dahmer, GEIN and Andrei Chikatilo. But she also discusses other cases, and with her background in clinical psychology, let me actually get her background for you here. She is particularly interested in abnormal and clinical psychology, and when she did her psychology, when she actually did her psychology degree. Hello, this is your host, Dan Zapansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. My special guest today is Moira Martingale. She has written a book called Cannibal Killers. These are no ordinary killers. They are monsters who murder, mutilate, and carry out the most gruesome, unimaginable act of all, eating the flesh of their victims. Cannibal Killers includes the world's most evil psychopaths, Jeffrey Dahmer, GEIN, and Andrei Chikatilo, with 8 pages of harrowing photographs. Moira Martingale. I'm not sure if we have a connection with Moira Martingale as of yet. I think we may have a problem, but let's see if we have Moira Martingale. Hello, Moira? Anyway, we may have a problem, miscommunication. Moira is in Great Britain, and I've changed the time of my program from 8 p.m. in the evening to 9 a.m. to accommodate this interview. But there may have been some miscommunication, exactly who she was supposed to call at that time. So until she does get my email and the number, I will go through.
With abnormal and clinical psychology. Then I went on to do a master's degree in English, and I did an awful lot on Gothic literature, Dracula, and 19th century Gothic literature, and then I went on to do a PhD in Gothic literature. So I suppose the literature aspect, which also overlaps on evolutionary psychology and anthropological interests, I suppose I would call it, because I wouldn't say I'm an expert in anthropology, but I suppose it was all those things that came together, because the literary parts of writing about Dracula and various other vampire novels, you have an awful lot of the bloodlust aspects, the sexual aspects of books like Dracula, and if anyone's ever read any Anne Rice, those sort of, the sexuality that's attached to blood drinking, which has its roots in lots of other things like religion and so on, and our own primitive past. So I suppose all those are the things that drove me, and I suppose the first question is that when the issue of Jeffrey Dahmer and Andrei Chikatilo in Russia, they were all out. This all happened about the same time as Silence of the Lambs came out.
Right.
And because I'd done a lot of research, and because Silence of the Lambs seemed to be creating such a lot of shock, what people were saying is, what on earth possesses anyone to do something like this, to cannibalise somebody else's body? And I suppose I set out to answer that question in more of a research way than just writing a sort of verbal literary version of a slasher movie. I didn't really want it just to be like that. I wanted it to actually have some sensible research behind it. So that's what I tried to do. Whether it was successful or not is debatable, of course.
Right. Now, for the specific research done for the book, how long did it take? And maybe you can tell our audience, through your research, you found out some of the history of cannibalism. Can you give us a little bit of that?
Well, the problem is that when you talk about cannibalism, you have different aspects of it. You have the aspect of people who used to, if we look at our ancestors, the cannibalism was very much embedded in our own history, and you do get instances like the Sawney Bean case in Scotland back in, when was it, 15th century?
Right.
And he and his whole family lived out in a cave, and apparently just ate people. They captured people who were on the road and ate them. I don't think there was any sexual aspect to that at that time. I think it was purely expedience, if you like, because they were hungry and they